welcome we are on episode 8, actually, in part 2 of a kind of a two-part section that we were doing on the variables of a deal in Chasing the Vision in season 2 here. So in the last episode, we talked a lot about the different kind of terminology that you would hear within a deal, what that means so that you as an owner or whoever you may be, if you walk into one of these deals one day, or you even just have a discussion at a trade show about transactions or M&A activity, hopefully you can feel a little bit more knowledgeable as you go into those conversations. Knowledge is power. I totally believe that. So this time we are going to get a little bit more, I don't know that personal is the right word, but we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the variables of deals, share some stories, talk more about the importance of leadership teams and company culture and those kind of things and how that fits into the structure of a deal. So, Tim, I'm going to toss it to you and give you the hard job of kind of covering the ground very quickly that we've covered so far in part 1.
Mhm. Okay, you want to recap? Wow.
Mm-hmm. Ready, go. It's your turn.
Ready, go. Yeah, I think we did a good job of kind of introducing the concept of the deal structure and what it looks like. JT did a great job of describing a lot of terminology that's commonly used when you're in a mergers and acquisitions situation. And I'm sure hopefully the audience will reach back out to you, JT, for more information on a lot of that because you really just scratched the surface with it.
Mhm.
We talked about, at least from my perspective, how to approach it from a negotiation standpoint, how important it was to understand what you want out of a deal going into it, and really giving some thought to the planning side of things and how you want this thing to turn out in the very end. We did get into some detail. We talked a little bit about, things like earnouts and
Mm.
rollover equity and those types of things as it relates to this. But I'm looking forward to this episode. And like you said, kind of jumping in the weeds a little bit, getting a little more intimate with it. And, maybe we'll talk about my favorite topic, which is net working capital and the headache that throws into most deals that are respectable in size. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
You
looking
can have it, Tim. It's all yours.
That's why I don't have any hair left,
Yeah,
JT.
that makes two of us.
Yeah. We cannot make it through any of these episodes without hair comments. I really am going to create a highlight reel at some point.
I love it.
Okay,
Love it.
so I think when anybody hears the term M&A, I think everybody has kind of a different image that pops into their head. So, JT, I'm actually going to toss this to you first since I tossed the other question to Tim first. When you hear M&A, I'm sure that what you envision, because this is literally your life career, what you've made a career out of, what pops into your head?
Well, M&A is really mergers and acquisitions, and that's what it stands for. Everybody knows that. And really, it's any deal that's larger than an SBA deal. That's what it means in my world, right? SBA is good for, it used to be up to 5 million only. And now there's a couple lenders making bridge loans that'll go up to 8, 9 million, which is great because if you were in this 5.5 to $8 million range, you were kind of in no man's land. There wasn't, you weren't large enough for private equity, but you were too large for SBA. So you landed in this real funny space. But really, anything over 5, 6 million is considered a mergers and acquisitions transaction. But that's at a very high level. It has more to do with the type of buyer. And those types of buyers can be straight private equity. They can be wealth family offices. They can be search funds. They can be any number of vehicles within the private equity banner. And it really means that there's probably going to be a merger of some sort between a private equity with some rollover equity, which we talked about last time. But it's really the larger transactions that SBA can't cover. That's at a real high level. I'll just stop there and let Tim fill in a few blanks if he wants to, but we can drill down, wherever the conversation takes us. But at a high level, that's where I'll stop.
Really quick, is there a different term then for the $5 million or less, like the SBA loan deals? Like, what would you say if it's not M&A? Like, what's the right terminology for that?
I don't know that there's a branded name for it. I just call it a smaller transaction, and I don't do many of those anymore. But most of the industry is made up of sub 5, 6, $7 million deals, and there's
Yeah.
still a lot of money to be made. They're great people, great companies. It's the ones that grow and really are able to scale. They've probably worked with Violand and learned how to replicate themselves and put in the right systems and procedures, and that it just lends itself to a larger transaction.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, Tim, when you hear M&A, because you come at it from a consultant standpoint, and an operations standpoint, what do you think of when you hear M&A?
I guess I think of it as a discipline. I never really thought of it, JT, as a term or a label based on the size of the transaction.
Hmm.
Although they're much different, like as you alluded to, and I think we talked about earlier, the amount of support necessary to make it through a transaction that is sizable. There's more risk involved from a buyer standpoint, so there's a lot more red tape, if you will, to navigate. A lot more things to kind of take a look at. I guess it's one thing, if you look at it from a real estate standpoint, buying a lot versus buying a house or buying a commercial property, like everything's got a due diligence period, and some are shorter and some are less. But I guess to answer your question directly, Michelle, I look at it as a discipline. So whether you're selling, and it's a $200,000 transaction or a $20 million transaction, I kind of approach both scenarios the same. The devil's kind of in the details, which is what this episode is really all about. So.
Okay. All right. So we just gave a good summary at the beginning of this episode. So I asked a little bit about what you've both felt was the most important variable in the last episode. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. So Tim, let's start with you. When you talk about the critical variables of a transaction, what do you believe is like one of the most critical that helps dictate the overall structure?
I mean, that there can be a lot there,
Yeah.
Michelle, as we alluded to in the first episode. But I guess coming at it from our perspective, from consultants' perspective, our job is to grow businesses, not necessarily sell them. But if that's the end game, and that's the prize or the trophy that you're shooting for, then we're all on board with it. So we work with only select individuals in the M&A world. Usually, it's the buyers that are soliciting our clients. I think if I looked at each of those clients and had to kind of draw some commonalities between them, all of them that get solicited and eventually go to a deal that comes full circle, they all have strong local brand images. They've got good market positions. They've got strong leadership teams.
Hmm.
They've got their stuff together, if you will. But a lot of them have a tendency to be mitigation heavy. So if we're looking just specifically at restoration contractors, it's no secret that that's where really the gross profit margin lines deepen. But I would say those are probably like the top three attributes, if you will,
Okay.
of those organizations. And of course, cash. They turn a lot of cash through the business. So.
Yeah. Okay, JT, what's your take on kind of most critical variables?
Well, I'll just add to what Tim said when he said is they have their stuff together. It's true. You just have to have your house in order, so to
Yeah.
speak. And it starts with the numbers. You got to be making some money, and you've got to hit certain margins or you're not attractive to anybody. But then you peel the financial layer back, you're instantly into your rate of growth and the trajectory, and how was that built? Was it daily bread and butter of the $10,000 to $12,000 mitigation jobs? Was there a bunch of large loss or
Mhm.
cat projects in there? If they're not, that that's terrible, you can have some cat projects if you do them consistently. If you have a cat project once every 4 years, that probably isn't going to be counted towards your adjusted EBITDA. There's just no predictability there, and that's what it comes down to. Any buyer wants to predict the future. And if they're really comfortable with how that's going to look, their confidence jumps, which means the value of that business remains high. And other variables can be the cleanliness of your books and the stability and experience of your leadership and management team. And, how many hats does a seller wear? If you're working 70 hours a week and you're wearing 15 hats, well, that's very different than a seller working 20 hours a week. And maybe it's 10 hours a week on the business and another 10 hours sitting in the office working on the rental properties or
Mhm.
working on the next business plan, whatever it might be. So there's a lot that can affect a value and a structure outside of just the numbers. But I think it starts there, because if the numbers aren't in place, not a whole lot else matters.
Yeah. We have a lot of episodes on a lot of the things you just mentioned. We have episodes on the
Mm-hmm.
cleanliness of your books, owner involvement, the power of your team, all of that. So we have individual episodes that dive into, I think, a lot of the variables you just talked about. So, JT, what are some of the lesser known variables that kind of fly under the radar but are still important?
Well, we've probably hit many of those in the first episode, but I'd like to, if possible, just drill a little deeper into some of these. And we talked a bit about earnouts and what those look like. Let me just start there. What people don't realize about earnouts is there's a whole nother set of details. They're a part of many larger transactions, and people just assume that it's some form of penalty, and I think we've cleared up that it's not negotiated correctly, they can actually be in your favor. So then the next question is, how might those get paid out?
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell potential sellers there's two buckets of earnouts. There's a time bucket and there's a money bucket. And I'm going to keep these really simple for the listening audience. A time bucket might be the buyer would pay you X% of sales for a 2-year period, 3-year period, 5-year period, whatever that is, whether you recover another 100,000 or 10 million, they're going to pay you for a certain time period. That's a time bucket. Then there's a money bucket. We're going to pay you X% of sales until we hit $1 million, $5 million, whatever the money bucket is defined as. Most are combined. There can be, you put the money in the time bucket together. They might say, we're going to pay you a percentage of sales for a 3-year period or until $5 million is reached. So there's a lot of ways, just in those two variables, a lot of ways they can come together. There can be pro rata shares. There can be what we call cliffs, meaning if you don't achieve this number, you get nothing. A pro rata share is if you hit at least a baseline. If you fall between a baseline and then let's say a target, you get a pro rata share of what's in there, which is mostly how they're done. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of nuances to a lot of these variables that frankly, and this may come off wrong, but Tim, you said owners wanting to know, and we might be further down in the weeds. Owners don't really want to know until they want to know. If that makes sense. I can meet someone at trade shows, Tim, you can meet someone at trade shows. They're not ready at all. They don't really want answers. They can't get past Friday, let alone the end of the year or the end of the month, right? But then when they want to know, there's a triggering event in their life and they really do want to know. Now it's time to go down into the details. Before that, it can just be white noise. So that's why some of this is kind of kept at a high level until they really want to know, and then it's going to be absorbed and taken seriously. So that's a little. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, it's funny that you mentioned that because one of the things I was thinking as you were talking through that is at least the worksheets that I use whenever I plan out, I've got 2 of them. I've got one that's the initial, the high level 8 negotiable criteria we talked about in the first episode. But then I've got another one that's for due diligence. And that's where it's got and I don't even talk about that. I don't even think about that until if you can't get through the first exercise, then you're probably not ready for the second exercise.
That's right. No, very well said. So we can talk at length about some of this stuff, and eyes are probably already glossing over here as we drill down a little bit deeper. But when somebody really wants to know, we've got answers.
Perfect. I was trying to decide if we're in a college class, are we 100 level? I don't think so. I think we're beyond that. I think we're 200 or 300 level, but we're not like 600 level yet. That's when you need to have some one-on-one calls. But we're getting through a lot here. So Tim, anything else you want to add from what JT was talking about lesser known variables that sometimes fly under the radar?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that comment about the devil's being in the details. When we talk about things like non-competes, I mean, that's a common one that comes up. You don't really talk about it a whole lot in an LOI stage. So when you're at the very beginning, they'll say, yeah, we'll want a non-compete. Okay, what's that mean? And you're like, okay, I agree with it. Let's go ahead and move forward. But then when you start thinking about it and you get, closer and closer to closing, now we're talking about, all right, well, what services are you allowed to be employed in and not be employed in? What's the geographic territory? What's the time frame involved? So all these little things start coming into play, and it's a bargaining exercise that goes back and forth. And the golden rule, at least that I teach, is you don't give anything up without getting something of value in return. So if you're going to give them a blanket non-compete for 5 years and agree not to work for any company that does anything remotely close to what they do, you better be getting something from the other, 7 or 8 different criteria that's got value to you in return, because that's going to have real value to you down the road, whether you think so or not.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about alignment between the buyer and seller. So, JT, how often is what the owner anticipates the deal structure to be the same as what the buyer anticipates the deal structure to be?
Oh, another loaded question. I love these. The alignment. Basically, I think what you're asking is, do the buyer and the seller approach a transaction the same way? And I'm going to say yes, but it comes with about 4 different asterisks.
Yes, but.
Yes, but. We'll repeat that 4 times. It is a yes, but however, it comes back to asking the right questions and receiving the right answers. And what I find frustrating is that people will call and they already have an assumption of how these are supposed to go. And then I'm the bad guy saying, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And you'll never sell it with that structure. It just isn't going to happen. And they heard some friend of a friend sitting around a bar saying that it went that way. And now I'm the bad guy. And in fact, it just happened to me last week. Here's the story. Numbers are down on materially down on a remediation only company. This is on the West Coast. And he said, I want to go back and use 5 years of my numbers. And I want it to be a simple average. And he knew something. This seller knew something about valuations. He said, I know you're only supposed to use, 1 or 2 years, maybe 3, but I need to go 5 to hit my number. And I said, no buyer looks back 5 years. They will look back. They're not going to include numbers from 2019 and 2020. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And he said, well, am I talking to the wrong valuation expert? And I said, yes, you are. I said, I can't value it that way. And I said, if you want me to do that to arrive at a number, I will put a great big asterisk on it that takes me off the hook. And he couldn't understand why I would do that. And needless to say, we're not going to go down the road together. There's certain things from my seat I can't violate. So it comes back to expectations. And if you're aligned with how the market is working and you understand that there's value in that to you, then yes, everybody's aligned. There's always hiccups in a deal. I don't know that I've had a smooth one yet in 25 years, perfectly smooth, that is. Every deal takes on a life of its own. But I can say when a seller gets educated, they ask the right questions, and it seemingly never falls to the buyer because they work with market, as we call it. They're in line with market expectations. When we go to the buyers and present the deal, I have my last page of a SIM, the confidential information memorandum. The last page is, here's the expectations. Here's what's included, not included. Here's what we expect. Here's what we don't expect. And basically say, if you're not in alignment with these expectations, there'll be very little communication moving forward. And that's how I just cut it off at the past. And it tends to streamline things pretty well.
All right. Tim, anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, on the alignment topic, absolutely. But I do want to come back and talk about networking capital because I think we skipped over that section. That was going to be my favorite discussion.
Yes.
But I think this is probably a good segue into that because when you talk about the needs, wants, and expectations, which you mentioned, that SIM, which I love that in what you do, JT. And I'm going to give kind of like a shameless plug for us in the professional services arena over here. But I mean, it starts with having good counsel, like having people around you that can navigate the process or help you navigate the process is invaluable. And even from the expert side of things, going through this myself personally, you still have to have people to kind of keep your head level because emotions start to kick in and they start undressing you during this period that we call due diligence, and it's very invasive in a lot of ways. And you can look at it from a couple different angles, but eventually everybody's got the same intention. Let's get a deal done, but how you go about getting there can differ wildly from party to party. So I would say get educated early for one. Surround yourself with good counsel. But at the end of the day, you're going to talk about those things that we talked about earlier with the inside of the 8 negotiable criteria. So whether you talk about it at the LOI stage or early in due diligence, it's got to be discussed or debated or negotiated before you hit the closing table eventually. So you might as well throw it out early in the process and tackle it and talk about what the expectations of each of the parties are. Because if you're miles apart at the beginning, you're not going to get much closer towards the end of the deal. So don't ignore it. Don't think, hey, we haven't talked about, holdbacks yet. I know it's going to be in the sales contract, but let's just wait till they throw us the draft a week before closing. That's not the time to negotiate that kind of stuff. Start talking about it early in the process.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim, because I use a term called failing fast. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason that I use the approach I do is that I don't want to string out a seller or a buyer for 2 months, 6 weeks. If it's going to fail, I want it to fail this afternoon or tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
not weeks from now after, you know, another dozen Zooms and we've looped into CPA to talk taxes and we've had strategy meetings. Let's fail fast and move on if it's not the right buyer.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, anything else you want to add on networking capital? Anything we missed before I move
Oh,
on? It's
it's such a big
a lot.
deal. I mean, we can't ignore it. And it comes from a place of misunderstanding. I mean, JT, you kind of talked about definitions a little bit there, but in essence, the networking capital in business, it's part of the valuation. So when JT, and maybe you could talk about that a little bit now to kind of get us kicked off, but how do you view or look at networking capital when you're doing a valuation? Start there.
Well, networking capital is essentially some cash that needs to be included with a business. And from my seat, when I say cash, this is in the industry we say it's the gas and oil that makes the engine go around, right? You don't buy a business devoid of any cash or receivables because then they have to come to the table with another, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to keep the engine moving. So it's part of the transaction. Best case scenarios, and it often is the case in the restoration space, the networking figure is less than the receivables. Okay, accounts receivable is included with the transaction, meaning that goes to the buyer. You've
Mhm.
recognized it on an accrual basis. They're paying you a multiple on that off your P&L and your adjusted EBITDA. So it goes. Now, the exceptions to that could be extended AR, slow pays that you've, hired an attorney for, and we can carve some things out. That's a whole nother discussion. But in general, ARs go. So the lesser number is networking capital. It's included in that AR figure. So if you've got accounts receivable of, let's say, $3 million on a sizable company, but net working capital is 2 million. You don't include 5 million with a business. It's 3 million because it's included in the ARs. Now, the heartburn that Tim is talking about, and I'll let him expand on this, is that there is a target net working capital figure that gets calculated for the balance sheet. And every buyer wants to believe that it's a straight math calculation. And in theory, it is. In reality, is that it's a negotiable figure. It really is. And so you talk to a seller about what it takes to run the business, and they'll say, well, I don't need that kind of money to run the business. Well, according to the balance sheet, you do. Okay. But it's enough money to run the business and pay the bills until these receivables start showing up to cover all the bills.
Mhm.
And so, as Tim, you mentioned, and I don't want to steal your thunder here, but you threw out the term that it can be viewed as a win-lose game. And that is not the case. There is a
Mhm.
figure that gets calculated and can be negotiated within reason. That's the financial requirements to keep the business going. And so it's not the seller being penalized due to more cash that he has to leave, or more receivables, or the buyer winning because there's less. It's it's rare is the situation that actual cash has to be put into the transaction, because on a cash-free, debt-free basis, the seller gets to keep the cash. If there's 500,000 in the checkbook, that goes to the seller. That's yours. If the rare instance occurs where net working capital is higher than accounts receivable, then we've got to take some of that cash to make up the difference. So, how did I do, Tim? Just to pollute your answer, how's that?
No, you did great.
Pollute your answer.
You set it up perfectly.
Perfect.
And explaining all of that is the most difficult part, I think, at least from my side, to somebody that's selling a business. And when you look at that valuation, think of it this way, there's let's call it a 6 month period of time, just to use kind of like round figures, but between when somebody issues an LLI and they close the deal, right? That period of time is due diligence in the middle. That's when they're doing kind of the proverbial home inspection to make sure that they're actually getting what they thought they were going to buy, that kind of thing. Well, when they valued the business and made the initial LOI or offer, they said we feel the business is worth this, and that includes ongoing operations. We're gonna pick up this business, and work's still going on all the time, right? And at the time that we valued it, when we issued the LOI, the net working capital figure was X. Let's just call it a $2 million deal, and there's $200,000 in net working capital at that time. Well, 6 months later, they're going to expect to get a business that still has $200,000 in net working capital in it. That's what they're
Mhm.
buying, right? It's not that the seller has to come up with 200K in cash at the closing table. That's what they
Mhm.
think, right? They set a peg number. So if the peg number is $200,000, all they're saying is we still want the net working capital amount to be 200,000 at the closing table. If it's $150,000, then we're just going to adjust the purchase price accordingly. So it's
Mhm.
a $50,000 differential. Now here's the good side to that. If there's $250,000 in net working capital at closing, guess who gets the extra 50,000? So there's a benefit and a risk on both sides, but like you said, it's not a win-lose. Like I'm going to try to
Mhm.
beat down the seller to minimize that net working capital number. It's an equation, and it's about
Mhm.
getting to the right number and having a good understanding of what made up that calculation. And there's a lot of different variables that go into that. It could
Mhm.
be the invoicing cycle time. It could be the receivables that are on the balance sheet and the quality of those receivables. They could
Mhm.
have $300,000, in an over 90 status, but if that $300,000 has been there for 4 years and you're never going to collect it, you got to take that out of the equation.
Mhm.
So having an understanding about that early on is really important. Prepaid expenses like your payroll taxes, all those things have been paid in advance by the previous owner prior to closing. Well, if they're picking it up, which period of time did that cover?
Yep.
So there's a lot of different things. Software subscriptions, for example, you pay for them annually, and who's getting the benefit of those
Mhm.
post acquisition? So there's a lot to take into consideration. But I think the big takeaway that I want everybody to understand, if you're on the sell side, this is not a shell game. This isn't like the buyer's trying to slip one past
Mhm.
you when you get there. There could be a benefit to you on the backside. It could actually, deepen the cash at closing instead of being a hindrance. But having your books in order, oh my goodness, how many times have we come back to that? You
Yeah.
gotta have clean financials. So if we're going to get to the right answer, we need to be looking at the right numbers.
Yes.
Now
So
there's probably listeners all over the country popping Advil and Tylenol as we speak because of a headache that formed a couple of minutes ago. But the only thing I'll add to that, Tim, that was perfect, is that the reason that there's a little bit of gray area is that let's say we were closing this Friday on a business. You've got to submit a forecasted balance sheet. You don't know quite what it looks like by way of cash and receivables and payables and when payments got pulled out of the account. So there's always this true up period. It's typically 90 days post close, and we have this opportunity to finalize the balance sheet and then go back and look at the target that we set and then true it up. And typically we're not far off if the right estimates were provided in the balance sheet. But that's why it gets gray area, and that even further confounds the seller as to why it's a mystery, post close. But that's why we're using forecasted numbers.
yeah, and the timing of that, I think you bring up a great point, JT. When we talk about adjusting the sell price at close at the table, we're usually talking about large numbers here. So
Mm-hmm.
if there's a three or 400, $500,000 adjustment, the buyer's not going to want to wait until 90 days later. That's why they use that peg number. They use that
Mm-hmm.
target number. They're estimating what it's going to be post close, but we all know that we can't settle our books today, depending on when it is during the month. We've got to have time for latent invoices and things to come in. So you get that, 3 week, 4 week period of time where you're collecting all the bills
Mm-hmm.
that were still on the old company, and you're kind of hashing through that and determining what goes where. So there's oftentimes another true up that a close that you're referring to post transaction where they're going to say, all right, well, this was the estimate at closing and this is the actual closing. There still needs to be a remedy there. So the timing of that can oftentimes be important. That's why a lot of companies will try to push, if your fiscal year is on a calendar year, let's get it done this year. They don't want it to roll into the next year because then it just creates a whole nother set of circumstances, at least for the accountants.
Yeah.
Nice for the accountants. Okay, before we talk about outside the box deal structures and negotiating, I'm actually going to skip forward based on the conversation we just have had. And how many times do you guys have sellers who get to the point where they just throw their hands up and go, I can't do this. This is overwhelming. This is whatever. We're partway into through this deal, and maybe due diligence is too much. Maybe toward the end is just any point it just is too much. So, Tim, I'll toss that one to you first. How many times do you have people just throw their hands up and be like, this is too much?
Um, I mean, you said it can be, overwhelming in a lot of ways, and it is,
Yeah.
especially if you're not accustomed to kind of navigating this field.
Hmm.
And the due diligence period, as I mentioned before, is very invasive.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had a client just kind of give up once they get into due diligence. I've had clients kind of walk away from the table, but generally that occurs like way early in the process when they get the LOI initially. Maybe they're negotiating it or they're contemplating it and they're sitting down having discussions with the potential buyer. And they go, you know what? The more I talk to this person, the more our values aren't in alignment, the more they volunteer as far as what their future intentions with the business are. And they start to gather that information and they go, you know what? I'm probably not going to go down this road any longer. And I guess the best example is a personal one that I had when I was younger, and I didn't even know anything about mergers and acquisitions. When I was in the business, first restoration company I worked for, it was for sale. It wasn't public knowledge, but it was for sale. And it wasn't until later that I understand that they actually had an offer to buy the full asking price. They gave them everything that they wanted. And then our owner asked a simple question, what's your intention with, this one location that we had? And he said, well, we're probably going to close that location. Well, to him, that was deeply meaningful because the business represented a family element to him, and he was very proud of what he did. And he walked away from the deal. So it's not about price all the time. And you get back to the quality element that we talked about in the first episode. If the quality of the buyer or the seller, if you're on the buying side, is not there, then usually those deals fall apart pretty early in the process.
JT, what's your take on, do you have some clients who just are like, oh, this, never mind?
It happens. It happens. It is normally due to broken expectations, right? More data is revealed, personalities can come out. It can fall apart for any number of reasons, but typically it's based on an expectation. When I want to circle back to something Tim mentioned about being invasive. And in general, owners are not prepared for the level of invasiveness that it is. It's really, really invasive. And there are a lot of good people in this industry, which is why I wanted to specialize in it. But what happens is you get an owner who wants to shake someone's hand and say, okay, let's do this. And they think due diligence is going to be a week or two. The CPA will call and ask a couple questions, and let's get the attorneys involved and get this thing wrapped up. Well, it doesn't work that way. You wade through a due diligence list,
Mhm.
and they get what I call a dead copy or a CPA copy of your QuickBooks or your PSA, whatever it is, and they go through every transaction you've had for 3 years, 5 years, 6 years. They're going to understand your business better than you do, and that's a guarantee. And financially, they're going to take a look at it. So that level of invasiveness, they need to be prepared for it, or it really takes them back. And if they expect it, not a big deal. If they don't, they're on their heels almost every time. But what happens is when somebody's going to write you a big check, whether that's 300,000 or 100 million, the buyer has earned that right. It needs to be invasive. Their
Mhm.
attitude is trust but verify. I
Mhm.
believe you.
Mhm.
I understand what you're doing. I've read a 50, 60 page sim. I have a pretty good idea of what we're buying. Now we have to verify.
Mhm.
They've got boards to answer to. They've got investors to answer to. They just can't take your word for it. As much as we want them to, they can't. And so when the hands get thrown up, we have exhausted every possibility. We've tried plan B, C, D, and E. We've tried this angle or that angle. And if nothing works, it's not the right buyer and it's time to walk away.
Okay. All right.
That
This is,
reminds me.
go ahead.
That reminds me of a comment that somebody said one time, and I heard it and I loved it. They said, I like you, but I don't know you very well."
Mm,
Mm-hmm. I
So
love
it's
it.
it's
yeah.
it's about getting to know somebody,
Yeah.
that process. And the longer it goes on, the more expensive it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is my favorite question of, I think, this two-part series actually is talking about ways that you two have seen deals get creative, thinking outside the box. So, Tim, I'll toss this one to you first. Do you have any examples of a deal that
Yeah.
maybe you've been involved in where people thought outside the box to get it across the finish line?
Yeah, I mean the one that I'm going to use is probably the smallest deal I've ever done. But I thought of another one kind of while we were talking in the first episode. I actually renegotiated a deal
Oh,
one time, and this was a bunch of years ago. But this individual had purchased a business and then come to us at Violand and said, "Here, can you help me? I just bought this thing." And in about 6 months, it didn't take very long for us to realize that it was a bad deal, sustainability wise. So the individual had taken, a partial an SBA loan to finance part of the acquisition, but then the rest was a fixed note on JT. So we had, like a 5-year commitment with a fixed interest rate, which wasn't real great either. And we looked at refinancing, we looked at a bunch of different options, but at the end of the day, it was a bad deal. So between those payment commitments, this individual didn't have any operating capital to continue to operate the business, let alone grow it. And given the fact that the fixed note was so sizable, we had a little bit of leverage there. The options are default, and the person either gets the business back or it goes defunct, or we renegotiate the deal. So we were able to renegotiate the purchase price of that business a year after it was actually done, which I thought was kind of interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
as it turned out, very beneficial for all parties. So the seller ended up getting paid, and the individual who purchased it has done a great job of growing that business over the years. So it was an interesting. But I would say creative wise, thinking back to the criteria side of things, the probably most creative one I ever did was recently. We closed at the end of last year. And I wasn't really even going to take this assignment. Somebody had called me out of the blue. And it was really small. I mean, we're talking really small. And they said, I want help selling my business, but I don't know how to go about it. This is what I think it's worth. And they gave me a number, and I looked at it and I went, that's interesting. But the problem was it didn't have a lot of fixed assets. There wasn't much there. Almost entirely the business was intellectual property, believe it or not. I said, well, let me take a look at your financial statements. So I took a look at them, and in my humble opinion, given a very wide variance, I said, I think we can get a lot more for this business than what you think. And they already had a buyer. So they came to me with a buyer. They just wanted help navigating the process. I'm like, okay. So I sat down with both parties and I said, well, here's the way I'm looking at this, guys. And to long story short, we ended up selling the business for roughly twice what the seller had originally come to me with. And it was through talking through those details of the different criteria and allowing the buyer to realize that they weren't just getting manuals and intellectual property and training material and things like that. They were getting something that was it had cash flow associated with it. There was real value that we could translate into dollars and prove it over a very long period of time. So we were able to bring the deal together. Both parties ended up being really happy at the end, and yeah, so it was pretty interesting, but small, but an interesting process to go through.
okay. I like it. Okay, JT, your turn. Story time.
They're all interesting at this point, Tim. I'll tell you, accounting and buyer sophistication, they've all come a long way. So
Oh
you
yeah.
get a real in-depth look anymore the last 8, 10 years. Um, I've got a couple of great stories. One of them is I did a deal on a commercial cleaning business out of Portland, Oregon years ago when I was living there. And we were down to the last 150, 180,000 on this multi-million dollar deal, and no side was budging. But the seller was retiring, aged, not walking well, could not get in his 1967 Corvette anymore. He had dropped that at some point in one of our personal conversations. And he also was not using his Portland Trailblazer suite tickets. This was back in the day when Portland had a basketball team that was any good. And the buyer happened to like classic cars and was a big, big fan of the Portland Trailblazers. And so we worked in a $70,000 Portland Trailblazer suite and basically an $80,000 car at the time to bridge the gap. and both parties were thrilled that we did that. I don't recommend trading classic cars, to get a deal done, but it worked. So sometimes way out of the box is the right place to be. And early on in my career, here's another one, and this one just makes me smile. This is back in the day when we had to get together in the same conference room for meetings, not virtual like we do now.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to close this deal, and a last minute invoice had popped up. I believe it was $650. Couldn't tell you what it was anymore. And this was a $300,000 deal. Neither party was budging. Neither one of them wanted to take the $650. And it was personal at that point. It wasn't about the 650. It was about just getting the last one up on the other person. We happened to have a dartboard in the conference room.
Oh, no
and
way.
I looked up at this dartboard and I stood there and I just grabbed a dart and I threw it. And I said, "You guys want to play darts for the $650? And the buyer looked at me and said, "I'm in." And the seller says, "Let's do it." And at that point, it became a game.
Yeah.
And the buyer ended up losing. He gladly paid the 650. We all shook hands and gave each other bro hugs when it was done. But we played darts for the last 650. So I don't recommend that either. Not sure I could get away with that today, but always fun. So a couple of creative ways.
Is it common that it comes down to like the last little bit like that, or is it typically maybe a little bit easier to reach the final number? Is it normal that those were a couple examples.
That's a crazy question. It's a really, really good one. Let me give an example. The way I tee up my clients is very complete, it's very thorough. We try to cover all of the possibilities. They go into this with their eyes wide open.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened the last several times, the last 2, 3 years, buyers have come to me and like to negotiate. It's very solid. Put their clients in a very strong position. The buyers will come to me on the side and say, "Listen, I need a win. You've gotten this point, that point, the other point, and I need a win to bring back to my advisors or my investors.
Mm-hmm.
You got to give on something." And I love that because we don't have to win on every point. We just want to win on the important points, right? Yep. And so we'll throw out a win for them that they can take back and say, "Yeah, we got this point." Well, good for them. Maybe it didn't mean much to us, meant a lot to them. But when we have positioned clients that well that we have to throw out a faux win, I love that. And it means we're doing something right. So, last minute deals, a lot of times once you're in due diligence, there's always 15, 20 little things that pop up. There just are. There are miscellaneous invoices, miscellaneous income, certain job descriptions, or things that need to be renegotiated. And Tim is right. You don't want to give up anything without getting something. So there's negotiations oftentimes right through, within, 36 hours to closing table. Now they dwindle in importance. Oftentimes it's not like you're renegotiating price, although it can happen at the last minute based on current numbers. But little things seemingly pop up all through due diligence, and we just have to be prepared for those.
Yep. Okay. I like it. Okay, as we wrap up this episode, I would love to ask you both for final thoughts. So Tim, I'll toss it to you first. We've talked about a lot in the variables and deal structure, how it's made up. So if people were taking away 2 or 3 nuggets from this, what would you hope that they walk away with?
Well, I mean, the big one is hire professionals. Like,
Yeah.
don't don't try to navigate the process yourself. Ultimately, whatever fees you're going to pay your attorney, your accountant, your advisors, your broker, JT, I mean, they pay for themselves. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the professionals will uncover details that may seem meaningless, but they all have value to them. And the line I always use when working with our clients is, if you saw that amount of money laying on the street and you wouldn't walk past it, then we're not going to walk past it right now. It's meaningful. So oftentimes the fees that are associated with those professionals are minuscule compared to the benefit that you're going to get. The second thing I think I would encourage people to do is talk to business owners that have been through the process before. Ask them about what went good, what went bad. Reach out to them and hear their stories and allow yourself to understand the experiences that they've been through. But talk to people both on the good side and the bad side. Don't just talk to somebody and say, "Oh, it was a nightmare and this is what happened and you need to negotiate like your life depends on it," and all this other good stuff. Talk to people on both sides of the coin. And I think what you'll find is that there's some happy ground there, a lot of things you'll learn. And the last thing is do your homework on the buyers. So if you're on the sell side of the table, somebody approaches you about buying your business, um, find out who they are. And I'm not just talking about the entity that they represent, but get to know the people that you're negotiating with. Negotiation is a personal experience. You're not negotiating with entities, you're negotiating with people. So find out who they are, the background, what their tendencies are, personality, all that good stuff. Find out where their money is coming from. Are they have financing, private equity backing them? Is it an enterprise level in the industry that's out there? Find out who's really making the decisions. Because, like you said, JT, with your like give me win situation, they've got to justify the deal to somebody. They're not
Mhm.
personally writing the check from their own bank account.
Mhm.
Everybody answers to somebody. So it's got to get through, whether it's, the investors or the underwriters or the board or whoever. And then lastly, I think find out what their plan is for the business post acquisition and get as many details as you can. If that's important to you, you don't want to get down the road with a bunch of money in your bank and be disappointed or have seller's regret. So
Mhm.
find out what they're going to do with your business that you created, and if you can live with that scenario, great. But so those would be my parting words.
Okay, good tips. All right, JT, any final parting a few things that you would hope people walk away with?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The way I say, Tim, what you just mentioned was due diligence is a two-way street. You do need to understand who you're working with. People get in this mindset of it's all about the buyer investigating me and, am I worthy of being sold? And it's definitely a two-way street. So thanks for that in-depth answer, Tim. I'm going to restate my first point is kind of like Tim's. Ask the right questions. He indicated use professionals. I'll say just ask the right questions. You've got to have your expectations managed a little bit
Mhm.
because if they're not in alignment with what's really happening out there, you're going to be disappointed. And you can be disappointed, but let's start with what's really happening and what a deal's likely going to look like. And it's up to you and us as professionals to help you with what is likely going to happen so you can make the best decision. If we can pull some of that emotion out of it and you make a decision based on real events and real dollars that are probably going to happen, well, now you're that much closer to a good decision. And that's the goal. So, secondly, I would say be open. Every seller comes to the table with some expectations of how they think it's going to go. They've met somebody, they've had a brother-in-law, good friend sold a business, and this is how it went, and we need the exact same thing. Just be open. Sometimes it's better than that. Sometimes it's a little worse, and there could be good reasons for it. But be open to structures, to possibilities, to timing. If we run a valuation analysis on your business and it's worth 10 million today, but in 2 years it's worth 14.5, and here's why. Well, just don't want to sell. I'll sell a $10 million business. Why don't we wait a couple of years and get 14.5 for it?
Mhm.
Those are the kind of options that we give you. And I love the Violand clients because they're teed up. They've
Mhm.
got systems and procedures. They're in place to be making more money. The growth trajectory is typically right. And so I would be remiss if I didn't give you those kinds of options. So we'll get you confused first, and then we'll clear the fog. And then lastly, and I've said it once before, is you're in the driver's seat. Let's keep you there. When you're armed with power or knowledge, Michelle, you said knowledge is power. I believe that. Let's keep your hands on the wheel, sitting where you're supposed to sit, and the deal's going to go much smoother. It doesn't mean that we're always working against a buyer. They have to be happy too, but we can keep your hands on the wheel.
Yeah, love it. Okay. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. This was a great two-part series here. So for everybody who's listening, you can find more on the CNR website, on your favorite podcast platforms, on CNR's YouTube, wherever you want to look. You can find all of these episodes. You can go to violand.com and exitstrategies.com to find out more about Violand and exit strategies. Gentlemen, thank you. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, take care.